firstly, can you give me a bit of background on you and your research interests?
Okay, on me? Okay, so Peta Ashworth, I lead a group called Science into Society, and I've been at CSIRO in that role since about 2005. Before that I was at UQ working as a sort of managing the Centre for Social Research and Communication, but working as a consultant 3 days a week. Before that, worked for Body Shop, so an activist, and very much in the management side of the business. So, but I guess what actually led me to this was that thing where the work that I was doing around climate and energy. I saw new technologies being developed, and the idea of misinformation being put out there, and the potential for technologies to be shut down even before they're actually given an honest sort of opportunity to have a debate around them or discussion. And so that's what really motivated me I'd like to do more work in this area. And I guess the whole idea of in an institution like CSIRO, or even in the universities, this idea of people doing a lot of science and great science, but literally it just ends up on the shelf. So that whole idea of how do you operationalise the information there to get to the people that can use and respond to it. So in a lot of the cases in the energy technology early work that we did, it was actually to policymakers, to make them think about, well, when we actually do engage with the Australian public on these issues, what are their responses to that? And really, that very early work I did was around carbon capture and storage, which has the potential to mitigate greenhouse gas, but there's perceived risk and uncertainty, and then there's a lot of value things around its role in the carbon thing. And so at that stage, there wasn't a lot of information about it. And back then, when we first did some work, we were approached by CSIRO to do it. There was Friends of Earth who had put out a sort of negative piece around it, and then from the point of view of listening to the technical scientists, it's like, well, no, this actually does have an opportunity. And so my thing was, well, how do we make that happen? A debate around it. When we talked to the Australian public, they sort of felt, well, if we are exporting coal, we have a responsibility to try and clean it up for developing countries so that they can get access to energy. So it was, I suppose, those sorts of things that motivated me to do what I do. And out of that, it's this whole idea of how do you bring citizens in to engage on these topics of national significance, or, at what point do stakeholders become involved beyond the experts? My underlying thing is the role of information and how that plays, because there's lots of people that will poo-poo information, and that's something that I constantly think about, I suppose, because I believe it is important to underlie informed decisions around some of these complex issues. And also, if governments are investing large amounts of money in certain areas, then I think it's helpful for people to try and understand it. Now, they won't engage in all of it because people are too busy, but I think we need to give them the right to have access to that. And so I guess that's really underpinned the work that we started doing.
Yeah, it's great.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you've answered like 4 of them at once. So how would you describe the current level of interest in scientific issues for the general public in Australia?
I would answer that with it all depends. Really, I think, and it depends on lots of factors. It depends on how close the issue is to the individual. So, for example, and I can use energy a lot because we do a lot of work in that. So, wind, new wind developments. If there's a new wind development coming to a local community, people will engage much more than, say, someone living in Sydney who may not have it. If we take coal seam gas as a very topical issue right now, there's a lot of interest at all different levels. But when I say a lot, that actually might only be a small percentage of the community, but with very loud voices. So I think it really depends on the issue. The other thing is, we did some work very early on this issue of energy, and I had a sort of hypothesis: if you're going to engage people, you may as well start with influential, because when they can have bigger bang for the buck of sharing when there's limited resource to communicate. And I had an editor of a local paper up in country, Queensland, And one of the things he talked about with sort of carbon and climate was, well, you know, we're all so busy just trying to feed the kids and put the food on the table and get to work. We need you to tell us what to do. You know, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I think there's different levels depending on how close it is to their level of interest or what's affecting their own personal values, as well as what else is happening. And another big way can be what friends and family are thinking and responding to as well. So that sort of social norm influence is incredibly powerful. And I think that's what we're seeing, you know, with the uprising of different issues.
When you say, you know, they're too busy and they just want you to tell them what to do,
Mm-hmm.
do you think they look for that information from the science community or from the media?
I think so this was around energy, you know, carbon mitigation. They were saying, you know, we trust CSIRO, so that's right. So I think what happens with media in these sorts of in contentious issues, I think the general public often find the media confounds and confuses, because of course they report the opposing viewpoints within an article. And I often have people, when we were doing some citizens panels, you know, on climate way back in 0304, and it's a 3-day process, so people really engage in it. This woman came the next day and said, well, here's this article, you tell me who's right and who's wrong. And there was, you know, 4 different. So in that way, people would, but then it also depends on where they're at in their life. So we did some work with low socioeconomic on energy saving stuff, and we asked them where do they get their sources of information. And it was the Take 5 magazine, which I didn't even know what it was, and Current Affairs.
Yeah.
So again, it will depend on you know, levels of education and how much they want to. What was really interesting with that group though, because when we were doing it, there was lots of people saying, well, they won't even care about climate and energy, but several of them came up with things that they were doing personally and recognising that people dropping paper in everyone's mailbox is actually a really not sustainable practice. So, you know, it's those different levels.
Yeah. How would you describe the current level of understanding or knowledge in, I think I read that you've done research on the grassroots level, in that sort of group from society. What's the kind of base knowledge or understanding of broad scientific issues within Australia?
Again, it would vary.
Yeah.
And it really gets down to the level of where it's at within the public debate, in that public arena. A classic example is we do national surveys, so we've got public perception to energy. And the early work we did to get a baseline, in I think it was 2005, we did a sort of state survey of the whole of Queensland. And when we talked, and also New South Wales, and nuclear is one we always ask about, because, you know, it's just not regulated here, but it's an interesting, and it's very low carbon, but with all these value social-led issues. And in that survey, people were 2-1 against. Very clearly, you know, they were either for it, and the ones that were for tend to be older males. You know, you could actually put a demographic around them. When we did it in 2006, it was just prior to the election, the one that I think was the one that Howard lost. But up to that, there was a discussion that he was talking about uranium and nuclear and, you know, all of that.
Yeah.
It was playing out in the media, and when we found the next in that survey was that what it did was the 2-1 dropped, and a lot of people moved into the uncertain.
Yeah.
So that really struck me as well. So this is a topic that probably people don't know a lot about. They're not well informed, and when they suddenly see it being played out at a political level, at leaders, and then, you know, in the media, that actually makes them start to question. So, you know, there is a power in that. I think that perhaps, you know, we don't take note of, and it was just purely by chance that, you know, these surveys we could see that difference, and that was the contextual thing that had changed in the landscape on that topic.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's interesting around people's levels of knowledge about a topic and how far they. So vaccinations, you know, could be another one, that things where it personally affects you at different times.